So, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the keynote speech of our conference, which will be delivered by Professor Jim Roy of the University of Nottingham. Jim Roy is senior lecturer in classics at the University of Nottingham and has written on various aspects of classical Greek history, often in connection with Arcadia. And he also worked on studies of the history of Alice in collaboration with the Copenhagen Police Center. His research interests are Greek social and institutional history, the Greek countryside, and the local history and archaeology, especially of Arcadia and Alice. And his recent publications include an article on Alice, for example, in Funke Luragi's book on the politics of ethnicity and the crisis of the Peloponnesian League, an article of the Spartan-Ilian War of the 400 BC on Athenaeum, and another article on finding the limits of Laconia, defining and redefining communities on the Spartan-Arcadian frontier.
Professor Roy today will speak about war memorials in Pausanias. Pausanias is an ancient author writing in the 2nd century AD who records a huge quantity of war memorials dating to more ancient times, many of them dating to classical times. That's why we thought it could be an apt keynote speech in this workshop where we are discussing of the memory of war between ancient and modern times, because Pausanias' time is modernity in a way compared to the period the recorded materials come from. In fact, as Professor Roy will explain, Pausanias does not record material indiscriminately, but he's highly selective. Not only his personal interest, but even more the changing of the historical context and of the corresponding social frames and needs for identity determined which war memorials were worth recording and which not. So, please.
Well, thank you both very much for your introduction, and indeed thank you for inviting me to take part in this conference, from which I have already learned a good deal, I'm happy to say. I chose Pausanias for the reasons that Georgia has just outlined, because on the one hand, he's speaking about war, with one notable exception. He's speaking about wars that had happened generations earlier or even centuries earlier. And on the other hand, he covers a large number of communities, so it's possible to see how war was remembered, even in quite small communities in Greece of his time. Since the 1980s, roughly, there has been a great deal of work on Pausanias, and he emerges as a more complex author than people had tended to think. His work is shaped by a number of decisions that he had made. The most obvious was the regions that he would write about. He limited himself really to parts of central Greece and all of the Peloponnese. He occasionally mentions other regions, but his main concern is with that area. But even within that area, he treated different regions in different ways. In Arcadia, for instance, in the central Peloponnese, he gave very detailed geographical cover, whereas in Elis, in the western Peloponnese, even though that region exceptionally got 2 books instead of just 1, he says a great deal about Olympia, much less about the city of Elis, and almost nothing about anything else. So we have very limited coverage of most of Elis. In addition, he selected his material very carefully and omitted things that he didn't think were interesting. So his work cannot be treated as a complete catalogue of war memorials, even in these areas, but it does cover a great deal of material. It's worth noting that Pausanias himself thought that war was a very important part of the past. Over the course of writing his book, he developed the technique of providing a historical introduction to each region and then to major places within the region. He doesn't do it in the first book for Attica, but after that he does it. And in Book 8, which concerns Arcadia, for instance, he first gives an account of the Arcadian kings from Pelasgos, the earthborn, down to the last king, and then gives a historical review of Arcadia. It's very brief. It's simply 3 sections within one chapter. But in this brief text, he succeeds in mentioning the Trojan War, wars between Spartans and Messenians, the battle against the Persians at Plataea, the Peloponnesian War, the campaign in Asia Minor with Agesilaus, the Battle of Leuctra, alliance with Thebes after Leuctra, abstention from the battles against Philip at Chaironea and against Antipater in Thessaly, abstention from fighting against the Gauls, and finally enthusiastic membership, including war within the Achaean League. All this in one brief section. That's what he thinks matters about the past of Arcadia. And then when he comes to Arcadian cities, he does it again. For Tegea, for instance, he first notes events in which the Tegeans took part along with other Arcadians, like the Trojan War, the Persian War, the battle at Dipaia against the Spartans in the 5th century, and then goes on to specific Tegean exploits. The fact that Echemos of Tegea defeated Hylas in single combat when the Heraclidae returned to the Peloponnese, and that the Tegeans were the first Arcadians to fight off an attack by Spartans, most of whom they captured in that first campaign. So clearly for Pausanias himself, war is an extremely important part of the Greek past at every level, from the Pan-Hellenic down to the very local. In Pausanias' day, with one notable exception, which I'll come to, war was remote in time. Brelas, in a publication of Trento, has recently analyzed in what ways military cultures survived and influenced the collective identity of Greek cities in the Roman imperial period, when war rarely concerned directly the territories of mainland Greece. The exception comes at Elatea in Phocis. The Kostoboks, people from near Dacia, invaded Greece in 170 or perhaps 171 AD, and they attacked Elatea among other places. A local man, Nasibolos, raised a local force to oppose them and killed many of them, but himself died in the fighting. This Pausanias tells us. He goes on to say that in the town of Elatea, a bronze statue of Nasibolos stood in the street called the Street of the Runner, a street presumably renamed in his honor because, as Pausanias says, Nasibolos also had been an athlete and won prizes as a runner at the Olympic Games of 161 AD. But in this case, we can see also how Pausanias edits his material, because as it happens, an inscription has been found at Elatea. It's incomplete, but it honors Nasibolos, son of Nasibolos. The father seems to be the man who died fighting the Kostoboks, and then his son is the man honored. The text, or what survives of it, is very strange, because it says much more about the father than about the son who is being honored. And we learn that the father had been twice periodonekes. That's to say, he had won at all 4 of the major athletic festivals in Greece, and he'd done it twice. And he's also described in the text as best of the Greeks, Aristou Helenon, a title which, as Van Nijf has explained, was given to men who combined athletic achievements with general distinction in public life. Now, it cannot have been difficult to find out, to get information about Nasibolos at Elatea when Pausanias visited it, but he's clearly chosen to limit what he says about Mnesibolus. He never mentions that he was Periodonikes, for instance. But at any rate, this attack at Elatea, the attack of the Costa box, is completely exceptional. It's the only event of his military event of his own day that Pausanias mentions. Clearly, many memorials of war were grouped in the great centers, the sanctuaries, Delphi and Olympia, and at Athens too. There was a wealth of material. Of course, these shouldn't be neglected, but I will try to look a good deal at other smaller places rather than to concentrate on these major centers. When Pausanias was writing, some material was simply no longer available to him. The kind of tropaion that was put up on or near battlefields, as was explained this morning, would simply rot away. The wooden frame would rot away. And unless a more permanent monument was erected, the tropaion would disappear. So Pausanias couldn't write about such tropaia. But even without them, there was a wealth of material. War could be recalled in very many ways, even by a place name. At the very beginning of his book, in the first section of the first chapter of the first book about Attica, he mentions a small uninhabited island near Cape Sunion. It was called the island of Patroclus because a Ptolemaic naval commander called Patroclus, who had been sent by Ptolemy II to help the Athenians against Antigonus Gonatas of Macedon. This man, Patroclus, built a fort on the island, and the island became the island of Patroclus. It's notable when you read Pausanias that memorials from the mythical past appear alongside later, more historical memorials. And these mythical memorials often have an actual physical form. So, for instance, at Megara, Pausanias records historical memorials of war, like the bronze ram of a war galley that had been captured. But he also mentions the tomb of the mythical Megarios, who had come at the time of a Cretan invasion. He knew that there were various accounts of Megarios. He mentions a different Boeotian account. But the important point that I would want to make is that in the 2nd century AD, the Megarians could show the actual tomb of this mythical figure. And in the same way, at Phenios in Arcadia, Pausanias mentions a sanctuary of Pythian Apollo that was created by Heracles after he captured Elis. At Scotetas in Laconia, there was a statue of Heracles and a tropaion that was said to have been set up by Heracles after he killed Hippocoon and his sons. And at Thebes, in front of the temple of Artemis Euclea, there was a stone lion said to have been dedicated by Heracles after defeating the Orchomenians and their king Argenos. At Tegea, the major role played by the woman Marpessa and the other women of Tegea in defeating a Spartan attack was remembered. The event belongs to the barely historical period of the early Spartan king Charillus. But Pausanias saw the shield of Marpessa in the temple of Athena Alea at Tegea. Again, an actual physical object could be shown as a memorial of this supposed conflict. There are more examples, but it's clear that through a process that cannot now be traced, military events, even from myth, were attached to physical memorials so that they were commemorated in the same way as later events and became part of the local memory of war. And Pausanias says nothing to suggest that he viewed these memorials of myth any differently from other military memorials. Clearly, the fact that Pausanias could get information means that it was available. There are only 3 occasions when he offers no information about a military memorial. At Argos, he writes, I quote, "Passing over a statue of Creugas, a boxer, and a tropion set up over the Corinthians, there is," and so on. He never goes back to the tropion set up over the Corinthians, and he never explains the occasion for it. Then at Thespiae in Boeotia, he writes that not far from the Agora, there are a bronze Nike and a rather small temple of the Muses. And again, he gives no explanation of why this Nike was set up. But the saddest case of all is at Orchomenos in Arcadia. Below the city, there were heaps of stones spaced out at intervals and piled up, Pausanias says, over men who fell in war. But then he goes on, I quote, "With what Peloponnesians, Arcadians, or others they fought is not identified by inscriptions on the tombs, nor do the Orchomenians have any tradition. But these are exceptional cases. He may possibly have omitted other cases when he couldn't get information, but when he mentions a memorial, he usually can say more about it." He was himself certainly very well read. He was a cultivated man with a particular affection for Herodotus, clearly. And no doubt he consulted books when he needed to. For instance, in the case of the Athenian Caidias, who's already been mentioned, Caidias was killed fighting the Gauls, and his relatives dedicated his shield to Zeus Eleutherios at Athens. And Pausanias is able to quote verbatim the 4 lines of verse from the inscription that accompanied the dedication, even though the Roman commander Sulla took away all the shields from the store of Zeus Eleutherios. So presumably Pausanias didn't get the information on the spot. He may quite possibly have read it. But he did see a lot himself, and he often says so. He says that he saw the shield of Marpessa at Tegea. But despite his personal researches, he took a lot of information from local people, and he constantly uses phrases like "they say," Phasian, clearly referring to locals. He didn't feel obliged to believe all that he heard. In a famous passage in Book 6, he wrote, "I must tell all that is told by the Greeks, but I need not believe them all." And he's echoing there a famous statement by his favorite Herodotus in Book 7. And Pausanias was also well aware that there could be competing accounts. On the question of who fatally wounded the Boeotian commander Epaminondas in the battle at Mantinea in 362, he reports that the Mantineans say it was Macharion, a Mantinean. The Spartans say it was Macharion, a Spartan. And the Athenians and the Thebans agree that it was the Athenian Grelos, son of Xenophon. He had 3 different accounts of who did it. It's also now clear that he didn't simply travel once to the places that he visited, but rather that he went back, he revisited. And so he had ample opportunity to talk to local people about what could be seen. And as Pretzler has pointed out, he was particularly likely to talk to the local elite, people like himself, as Pretzler puts it, the wealthiest and best educated local families, the same people who were actively involved in maintaining local monuments and traditions. Though, of course, a preference for the elite might slant the information that he found. But certainly, he records many local beliefs. An obvious question is whether these beliefs were restricted simply to an elite or whether they were a genuine, widely held local tradition. One test would be whether there was cult attached to the memorial. But unfortunately, Pausanias mentions cult only on, I think, 5 occasions. In some cases, the cult was for a mythical figure. At Phenios in Arcadia, there were sacrifices to Iphicles as a hero. He was wounded in the first battle fought by Heracles against Augeas and the Eleans, and he was then, according to Pausanias' account, taken to Phenios, where he died and was buried. And the Pheniates in Pausanias' day so sacrificed to Iphicles as a hero. Then, when Heracles and the Thebans were about to do battle with the Orchomenians, an oracle foretold that they would win if the Theban who was most distinguished in descent agreed to die by his own hand, to commit suicide. The man in question, Antipoinos, was understandably reluctant, but his two daughters, Androclea and Alcis, volunteered to take his place and kill themselves. They were buried in the sanctuary of Artemis Euclea, and in Pausanias' day they received honors from the Thebans, cult honors. At Sparta and at Plataea, there was cult for historical figures. In front of the theatre at Sparta, the kings Pausanias and Leonidas were buried, and every year speeches were made in their memory, and a competition was held in which only Spartans could take part. And then at Plataea, near the entrance to the city, there were the graves of those who died fighting the Persians, and not far away an altar of Zeus Eleutherios. Games were still held there every 4 years in Pausanias' day. He doesn't discuss the games, nor when they were instituted, though in fact they're not attested before the 3rd century BC, and they may well only have been founded after Philip of Macedon, Philip II, brought the Plataeans back to their city long after the Thebans had destroyed it. Once they were founded, the Eleutheria, the games held at Plataea, became a major symbol of freedom to Greeks generally. But Pausanias doesn't mention the point, perhaps taking it for granted. He does, though, mention cult. And the final case of cult at Phigalia in Arcadia is problematic. Pausanias tells us that after defeating the Phigalians in battle, the Spartans besieged the town Phigalia. When the city wall was in danger, the Phigalians fled, or possibly were allowed to leave by the Spartans. This happened when Miltiades was archon at Athens in the 2nd year of the 30th Olympiad, which would be 659 BC. After the Phigalians had left the city, the Delphic oracle told them that if they tried by themselves to return, they would fail. But if they took with them 100 men from Orestasion, further east in Arcadia, 100 men from Orestasion who would die in the fighting, then the Phigalians would recover their city. 100 volunteers from Orestasion died fighting, and the Phigalians got their city back. And indeed, when Pausanias visited Phigalia, there was the polyandrion of the dead Orestasians, and they received an annual sacrifice as heroes. It's obvious that whether or not there is any historical foundation for this story, it has been significantly altered over time. The elaborate date by Athenian archon and Olympiad year does not belong to the 7th century BC. And the city wall that's mentioned in the story also does not belong in the Archaic period. There's no trace of an archaic wall at Phigalia. There are walls, but they're from the classical period. So it's now impossible to trace how the story developed, but it clearly has developed. But Pausanias takes no account of that. He simply tells us the story and mentions the cult, so that the story was still believed and acted on at Phigalia in his day. Pausanias did make mistakes. Not many, but some. One notorious one is his statement that the Mantineans, with the help of an army from the Achaean Federation, defeated the Spartan king Agis, son of Eudamidas, when he invaded their territory, and Agis was killed in the fighting. Agis, in fact, was killed in a coup d'etat at Sparta. He was seized and executed. And there's a long description of that in Plutarch's Life of Agis. So a death fighting the Mantineans seems simply wrong. And in addition, Pausanias says that the Mantinean commander against Agis was Podares, a grandson of the Mantinean Podares, who led the Mantineans against Epaminondas in the Battle of Mantinea in 362. Now, the grandson of a man who was killed, as Podares was in 362, the grandson of a man who was killed in 362 could not have led the Mantineans against Agis of Sparta in the 240s BC, when Agis was king. So that too is wrong. There are strange details about two families in Pausanias' account. One family is from Megalopolis, the other is from Mantinea. So this may be a local story which has somehow gone wrong that Pausanias took up. But certainly there's a mistake there. Another mistake concerns the Roman commander Lucius Mummius, who made lavish dedications at Olympia to celebrate his victory over the Achaeans in 146 BC. Pausanias wrote that he knew of no other Roman, whether a private citizen or a senator, who had made a dedication in a Greek sanctuary before Mummius. This is simply wrong, and Pausanias should have known that it was wrong, because he must have seen at Delphi the monument of Aemilius Lepidus, put up just in front of the Temple of Apollo in 167 BC. It was originally intended for the Macedonian king Perseus, but when Aemilius Paulus defeated Perseus, he took over the monument, made it his own. It was a very tall monument, and a visitor to Delphi could hardly miss it. So he's forgotten at least Aemilius Paulus, if not other things, when he says that Mummius was the first Roman to make a dedication in a Greek sanctuary. He makes other mistakes, but they're rare and they're not really a problem. They've been studied over time, and one can eliminate them from his account of monuments. Much more often, when elements in his account of a monument or a tradition are problematic, the problems are due to the way local accounts have developed. Precisely because Pausanias reports such a wealth of material from a very large number of communities, many of them small, in many cases we have little or no other evidence to elucidate how the version offered by Pausanias may have developed, even if, as in the case of the Heroan at Phigalia, the Heroan of the Orestesians, we can be sure that the account given by Pausanias must include invention. But in some cases, reasonable conjecture is possible. At Megalopolis, for instance, in Arcadia, a stoa, the stoa Meropolis, was erected from the booty won when the Megalopolitans, under the tyrant Aristodemos, defeated the Spartans under Acrotatus, son of Cleomenes, around 265 BC. Pausanias tells us this. Aristodemos also dedicated, on a hill in the southeastern area of the city of Megalopolis, a temple of the goddess Artemis Agrotera, a goddess who's otherwise unknown at Megalopolis. And Pausanias says nothing about why this temple was built. But in a forthcoming article, Annalisa Paradiso, and I'm grateful to her for letting me read her article and for permitting me to cite it here, Annalisa Paradiso stresses 3 points that Aristodemus won a victory over the Spartans. We know that from the dedication of the Stoa. That Artemis Agrotera was the deity to whom a Spartan army sacrificed before a battle when the enemy was already in sight. And thirdly, that the temple of Artemis Agrotera at Megalopolis was put on a hill in the part of the city, in the southeastern part of the city, the part which was approached by the road from Sparta. The road came up the Eurotas Valley and over into the basin of Megalopolis. So it's very likely that anyone coming to Megalopolis from Sparta would see the temple of Artemis Agrotera on the hill inside the city. The deity that the Spartan army sacrificed to would be sitting there in Megalopolis as a reminder of Spartan failure against Megalopolis. And then there are three cases, all involving major cities, where the developments behind what Pausanias tells us have been successfully explored. In Book 1 on Attica, Pausanias tells how, when the Persians landed at Marathon, they brought with them a block of marble from Paros, from which to create a trophy. The goddess Nemesis punished them for their presumption, and of course they were defeated at Marathon. And from the marble that the Persians had brought, a statue of Nemesis was made by the sculptor Phidias for the sanctuary of Nemesis at Rhamnos. Matthias Harker has shown how a tradition was probably invented by the Athenians in the 330s that allowed Rhamnos to become a lieu de mémoire, recalling victory over barbarians, the Persians, so that it became a suitable place to honor the Macedonian king Antigonus Gonatas, who defeated the Galatians, the barbarians. But those honors ended when Athens was freed from Macedonian control in 230-229. But nonetheless, Rhamnos continued to be seen as a notable memorial of victory over the Persians, which is how Pausanias presents it. Then Pausanias tells us twice that a colossal bronze statue of the goddess Athena was set up by the Athenians on the Acropolis between the entrance, the Propylaea, and the Erechtheion. It was set up as a tithe from their victory over the Persians at Marathon. Pausanias saw it. It was known as the bronze Athena, sometimes as Athena Promachos, but the bronze Athena to distinguish it from the gold and ivory statue of Athena inside the Parthenon. Both statues were by the sculptor Phidias. Olga Pelagia has examined the evidence, which is mainly archaeological, but includes a statement by Demosthenes that the bronze Athena was set up by the Athenians as a victory monument of the war against the barbarians, but the money was given by the Greeks. Pelagia takes that to mean that the money came from the members of the Delian League, not from booty taken. And on archaeological grounds, she argues that the statue will have been set up more or less at the same time as the Athena Parthenos, as part of the Periclean building program on the Acropolis. And then subsequently, it somehow became associated with Marathon. And finally, in Book 2, Pausanias gives the only ancient evidence for a victory of the Argives over the Spartans at Hysiae, in a battle dated, again with suspicious precision, to the archonship of Pisistratus at Athens, that's to say 669, 668. Elena Franchi has shown that given the serious difficulties that arise if an attempt is made to use a passage as evidence for a historical event, it's better to analyze it as an example of invention of tradition and evidence of the importance that archaic history had for the Greek elite under the Roman Empire. these three publications by Hake, Pelagia, and Franchi are models of how to read what lies under Pausanias' accounts of the memory of war. So, to conclude, Pausanias shows that memory of war were in his day an extremely important, indeed virtually a universal element of the past by which Greek communities defined themselves. The wars they used were safely in the past, generations, even centuries older, going back to the mythical past. But even from the mythical past, the memories were frequently attached to actual physical objects. In many cases, we cannot now trace how the memories evolved, but when there is sufficient evidence to allow analysis, it's clear that the memories had been reshaped, even reinvented over time, but continued to serve their social purpose regardless of their historical accuracy. And now to close, I'd like to show you something that's not in Pausanias, and to the best of my knowledge, not in any ancient Greek memorial of war. This is the war memorial of the French village Jansieu, of the men from Jansieu who died in the First World War. Jansieu is now attached to another village called Pigerolles, so you get a commune Jansieu-Pigerolles officially. But at the time of the First World War, Jansieu was on its own. Mostly the monument looks like very many other such monuments scattered across France after the First World War. And the names of the men from Jansieu who died are on the white plaque on the upper part of the inscription. The obviously unusual thing about this monument is the statue of a boy standing beside it. He's boy dressed in local costume of the time, and his arm is raised towards the monument. The monument stands in the middle of the village square, and if you go up to it, you see that the boy is actually shaking his fist at the monument, and below the names of the dead is the phrase, "Maudite soit la guerre," may the war be accursed. There are about half a dozen of these monuments here and there in France, all dating from after the First World War. But it's easy in Greek literature, say in Athenian tragedy, to find passages that mention the horror and the suffering that war can bring. But I know of no Greek memorial that condemns war as the memorial at Jansieu does. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich paper, and I think there are any questions, and perhaps Emanuele or Giulia can take the microphone, so if there are any questions, I don't think so.
Volevo prima, vediamo se qualche ospite.
Any questions or comments?
Just a comment. Thank you very much for your talk. I apologize because I missed it the first 10 minutes. And a question about that monument. You talked about Lucius Mummius and Aemilius Lepidus. Don't you think maybe Lucius Mummius were more famous because of all those titoli mummiani which were all around the Roman world? So if anyone had to think of a Roman consul or proconsul and at his monument, the first thing that they would come in mind, it was Lucius Mummius. I mean, it was there was such a lot of titoli Mummiani and monuments Mummiani, which it was impossible to think of others.
I'm sure that's true. Whether it was actually impossible to think of someone else, I'm not so sure. I mean, the monument of Amelia, not much of it is now left, but it is possible to reconstruct it. And it was a huge monument.
So it was too big not to be seen.
I think so. Yeah, it really was huge, a very tall column.
Very tall.
And so I'm sure that I can well believe that Mummius attracted much more attention, but Pausanias says absolutely that no other Roman had dedicated. And we know of there was Flamininus, there were other dedications. So he must have known. He just forgot. It was a bad day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Siamo stanchi.
Other questions or suggestions?
No. So let's thank Professor Roy once again. And let's have some rest now before gathering for dinner.
Okay.